The Drum, the Doll, and the Zombie by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland. Chapter 11. The last day of school before the new year would be Friday, December 17th, and as the Christmas vacation drew closer, Johnny grew more and more nervous and troubled. Part of his worry, of course, had to do with the trip he, Fergie, and the professor were taking to Portsmouth on the first Saturday of the Christmas break. Johnny was all too aware of the danger that might lurk. The other part of his worry came from Major Dixon's approaching departure and Johnny's decision about whether he wanted to stay in Dustin Heights or move with his father to Atlanta. It was a tough choice, and Johnny felt torn by it. The last week he had gone to St. Michael's Church every afternoon to pray for guidance, but he realized that in the end he alone would have to choose. He had tried to talk the matter over with the professor, but the old man had his own deep worries, as did Father Higgins. Fergie was not much help either. When Johnny brought the matter up, Fergie made a face. "Ah, Dixon, you know you belong in Dustin Heights," he said. "Who else can teach you to play baseball, and who else can keep me humble by beating me at chess?" But that was not enough for Johnny. Even though he had to admit he would miss Fergie terribly, Fergie had become the very best friend he had ever had. Even so, Johnny felt that he needed unbiased advice, not Fergie's wisecracks. With the professor, Father Higgins, and Fergie unable or unwilling to advise him, Johnny became more and more upset. In a way, it was almost a relief when Saturday morning came, and he once again got into the professor's maroon Pontiac for the drive north. 3 or 4 snowstorms had covered Dustin Heights with a crusted layer of snow. The streets were clear, though, and the professor had put snow tires on his car, so they were ready for any weather. Professor Childermass stopped in Cranbrook, the snooty section of Dustin Heights, where Fergie lived. Fergie came out lugging his plaid suitcase, and he clambered into the back seat of the car next to Johnny. Fergie's dad, a mild-looking, balding man who sold Bibles, shoes, and kitchenware door to door, came out to wave goodbye, and Fergie gave his father a jaunty salute. Then the three of them sped away on their mission. As they drove to Portsmouth, the professor explained what he intended to do. The danger, he said, was that the cord that Mama Sinestra had placed in Dr. Coote's pillow had turned into a fully developed monster that had fed off Dr. Coote's conscious mind, his soul, which the Voodoo priests called the gross Banangi. What kept Dr. Coote alive was the spirit of life itself, or the T Banangi. If the creature Mama Sinestra created was simply destroyed, then Dr. Coote's soul would not be able to return to the old man's body, and he would exist like a vegetable for the rest of his life. So the professor could not simply splash the feathery horror with holy water, as Father Higgins had done with the one from Grandma's pillow. Instead, he would have to perform a certain ritual that would separate the creature from Dr. Coote's psyche. Pardon me. That would be dangerous, because without a human mind to occupy and control it, the beast would be free to attack anyone it pleased. If he completed the ritual correctly, however, the professor would hold the uncanny creature captive inside a spell of his own. The professor had brought along with him a black leather valise with crumbling corners and rusty hinges, something like a doctor's bag. Inside were some magical implements that he had borrowed from his friend at Miskatonic University, which he hoped would help him set Dr. Coote free of the awful enchantment. Fergie listened as the professor talked, and then he said, "Swell, Prof. So what do me and Johnny do? Stand guard with our holy water sprinklers and douse the critter if it acts up?" "No," Professor Childermass said sternly. "I definitely do not want that. Byron, you and Johnny will have to stand guard, all right, but outside the door of the hospital room. I will have to use all my concentration to make sure I control this whirlamadoodle from the infernal regions. If I have to worry about you, Johnny, and Charlie all at once, then I may very well become distracted, and that would be fatal for everyone." "Ah, Prof," objected Fergie. "You know we can take care of ourselves." Professor Childermass set his mouth in a stubborn line. He clammed up, but as he drove on, he thought about the problem. He had told the boys only half of his motives for taking them along. It was true that the three of them had shared some wild adventures, and equally true that he valued their companionship and moral support. However, it was also true that he was afraid to leave them in Dustin Heights. He had not told anyone else, but the professor had called the police in Dustin Heights, Portsmouth, and Durham. He had described Mama Sinestra to them and had suggested that she was a deranged and dangerous character. All had promised to keep an eye out for her, but so far she had not been seen. As long as he did not know where Mama Sinestra was, the professor preferred having Johnny and Fergie with him. At least he thought she wouldn't get a crack at them in Dustin Heights while he was prancing around like some witch doctor in Portsmouth. However, he had no intention of exposing Fergie and Johnny to the dangerous possibility of the rituals going wrong, so he pondered about what he could do to ensure the boys were safe. He still had not solved the problem when he drove the Pontiac into the parking lot of Mercy Hospital. He picked his black bag up from the passenger seat and then groaned as they all stepped out of the car into the slush. "Look at this," he said in an angry voice. "Those Portsmouth people didn't even scrape out the parking lot. They just threw rock salt all over everything to get rid of the snow. Disgraceful." "What's wrong with that, Prof?" asked Fergie. "I mean, the salt melts the snow anyway, right?" Professor Childermass glared at Byron. "Oh, yes, indeedy, it melts the snow. And when a car goes rolling through the slush and mush, the salt flies up against the frame. And then what happens, my fine feathered friend?" You get a car that tastes like a pretzel?" teased Fergie, who knew the answer very well. "No," exploded the professor. "You get rust, also known as ferrous oxide. And what does rust do to a car? It destroys it, all because of those cheapo New Hampshireites. All because these cheapo New Hampshireites are too tight-fisted to invest in a couple of road scrapers. If I had them right here, I'd..." "Professor," pleaded Johnny, "we have to be quiet in the hospital." Professor Childermass noticed them for the first time. They had walked into the lobby of the hospital, where people sitting in chairs were looking at him curiously. He glanced back with defiance. "If any of you people work for the government department that salts the streets here," he said in a quiet but furious tone, "you should be ashamed of yourselves." Then he stalked over to the nurse's station and signed himself and the boys in as visitors. They went upstairs, with Fergie wondering aloud where they did amputations and autopsies. Johnny elbowed him in the ribs. "Be quiet, won't you?" he muttered. You're going to make them throw us out." Fergie piped down, though he was still grinning mischievously. When he opened the door of Dr. Coote's room, Todd Lamort, who was sitting in a chair next to the bed, glanced up from the book he had been reading. Dr. Coote looked awful. He had lost weight, and his usually fluffy white hair was pasted against his head. His eyes were closed, and his wide mouth was slightly open. Strips of white adhesive tape held a tube in place inside his left nostril. He wore striped pajamas, and his long, bony arms lay on top of the blanket. The knotted old hands half clenched. Johnny had to glance away. Dr. Coote looked like a dying man. "Hello," whispered Todd Lamort. "I didn't know you were coming." "It's kind of a spur-of-the-moment visit," replied Professor Childermass, setting his black bag at the foot of the hospital bed. "How has he been?" Lamort shook his head sadly. "Every once in a while he will mutter and groan, but he doesn't recognize anyone, and he won't talk to me no matter how hard I try to get him to speak." Said Professor Childermass. "I hate to see poor Charlie in this dreadful state. Have you had any more trouble at his house?" "No," replied Lamort. "I've been staying in the guest room because that drippy toilet keeps me awake. No one has tried to break in, and everyone has been very quiet. And everything has been very quiet." The professor nodded. "It's kind of you to stay there," he said, and to visit Dr. Coote. "I know he would want to thank you if he could." Lamort gave an embarrassed sort of smile. "Well, it's the least I could do," he muttered. He stretched and yawned. "I think I will leave now that you are here. I have one last examination on Monday before Christmas, and I need to study. Is there anything I can do?" "No, thank you," said Professor Childermass, and he snapped his fingers. "Or rather, yes, now that I think about it. How about taking Johnny and Byron with you? I want to stay and visit my old friend, but there's nothing they can do here. At least at Dr. Coote's house, they might play chess or read books from his collection of occult classics." "Sure," said Lamort. "If they don't mind riding in my beat-up old Ford, I'd be glad to take them." So Johnny and Fergie went with Todd Lamort, leaving the professor in Dr. Coote's room. To tell the truth, Johnny felt nothing but relief. Dr. Coote looked so terrible that he hated to be there, even though he felt guilty about deserting the old man. Fergie seemed irritated at missing the ritual, though he chatted with Lamort. "You French-Canadian?" he asked as they slooped along the slushy parking lot. "No," said Lamort. "I have French ancestors, though." "What made you think I was French-Canadian?" "Your name," said Fergie. "We got a lot of Canucks in Dustin Heights, and I thought they might be here too. And I thought maybe they were here too." "Sorry to disappoint you," said Lamort with a smile. They came to an old black 1947 Ford, its paint dull and rusty spots showing on its fenders. The upholstery in the car must have been full of holes because Lamort had thrown brown army blankets over both the front and back seats. The passenger side of the front seat held some papers and maps, so Fergie and Johnny got into the back. Lamort got the bulky engine started after 3 or 4 tries, and they clattered out of the lot. "I want to make a stop before we go to Dr. Coote's house," said Lamort. "It isn't far out of the way." They drove north toward Durham as Lamort apologized that the car heater wasn't working. They passed the University of New Hampshire campus and drove into the countryside. Durham is just a small village except for the university, so they were soon away from civilization. Lamort took a rutted side road, and before long a dilapidated 2-story farmhouse came into view. The barn had collapsed years ago and was hardly more than a jumble of ancient boards frosted with snow. The house itself was bare of paint, and the walls looked ready to tumble down. But someone was inside, because a drift of smoke came from one of 2 chimneys. "You might as well come in and get warmed up," he said. "I'll just be a few minutes." With the heater out of commission, and the Ford was frigid, so Johnny and Fergie gladly clambered out of the car. Lamort led them around to the back of the house. They walked into a warm kitchen where an old blackwood burning stove crackled and snapped. A coffee pot perked on the stove. Lamort closed the door behind Johnny and Fergie. "Grandma," he called. Flowered curtains hung over a doorway. A hand reached out and parted them, and an old woman came into the kitchen. She had long, scraggly gray hair, eyes that were squished into slits by pouches of fat, and a broad, evil mouth. Johnny and Fergie yelled simultaneously. Todd Lamort's hand clamped on their shoulders, keeping them from running. "Boys," purred Lamort, "I'd like you to meet my grandmother. You can call her Mama Sinistra." And that is the end of chapter 11.